Alaska is home to numerous remote outposts. Situated on the south side of the Seward Peninsula, one of the most famous is Nome, a birding hotspot inaccessible by road. Thankfully, it can be reached with an hour-and-a-half flight from Anchorage, with distant views of Denali en route, the highest point in North America. Nome's heyday was during the Gold Rush era, although nowadays only just over 3,500 people reside here. It retains a frontier town feel, complete with a rather rough and ready saloon bar. A key attraction for birders is the 250 miles of roads which fan out from the town. These are the Teller Highway, which goes northwest and which we didn't explore, the Cougarot Road heading north, and the Council Road, which runs generally east and past the famous Safety Sound. Having settled into our very comfortable hotel, we set out on our first afternoon along the Council Road. Just outside of town, we stopped at a gold dredger exhibition. An adjacent pool produced a feeding male red-necked phalarope. And using the cars as hides, we managed wonderful views of a pair of red-throated divers, with one sitting on a nest. Of course, they go by the name of loon rather than diver in North America. Further east, we made our first of what was to be a few visits to the Nome river mouth. A couple of waders feeding along the water's edge were quickly identified as a western sandpiper and a male red-necked phalarope. The sandpiper, in breeding plumage, showed the telltale rufous crown and scapulars and spotting on the flanks. On the estuarine marshes were a pair of golden plovers, with extensive white flanks, identifying them as Pacific. Plus a small flock of sandhill cranes. And our first of many long-tailed skewers. This one appeared to have a damaged wing, but it didn't seem to affect its flying skills. Sitting patiently under the road bridge was an adult peregrine falcon. We continued east along the coast of the Bering Sea for a sea watch off Cape Nome. Conditions were not ideal, with choppy seas and a cold, brisk wind. This made it difficult to film the birds we did see, which included a distant spectacled eider, but a flock of harlequin ducks was some compensation. The cold eventually got the better of us, and we drove back to Nome. After dinner, a visit to the town seafront proved that a midnight sun does not equate to heat. A juvenile common raven was sheltering at a nest site in a large satellite dish. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot to see at the beach. Just a few short-billed gulls. And a pair of glaucous gulls. This is a common large gull on the west coast of Alaska, unlike the south coast where glaucous winged predominates. Our first full day in Nome saw us back on the council road. Soon after leaving the town, we encountered a large duck feeding by the roadside. Suspicions were confirmed, as amazingly it was an immature male spectacled eider. The previous day's limited views of what was probably the same individual off Cape Nome were quickly put aside. Continuing along the coast road, we made various stops overlooking Safety Sound, a barrier lagoon which extends for over 15 miles. A biting wind off the Bering Sea meant there was none of the balmy weather we'd had in Anchorage. However, the birding was superb. Lapland buntings, called longspurs here, were the commonest passerine and generally approachable. Similarly, semi-palmated sandpipers were the commonest waders. There was little exposed mud, so they were feeding in the shallows. With others near nest sites in surrounding grass. Also foraging along the shoreline was a black turnstone. More usually associated with rocky coasts of the Pacific, their breeding range is confined to the coastal sedge meadows of western Alaska. A selection of species on a small island included a flock of common eider. Here in Alaska, they are of the Pacific subspecies. This is the largest race, and on the males the bill is distinctively orange, with a narrower and more pointed frontal lobe. Females show the same bill structure without the colour, and are a little paler than other common eider forms. Large flocks of gulls were around the Safety Sound Bridge, mostly black-legged kittiwakes. With many resting on the sandbanks. Joined by glaucous gulls. And a second calendar year Vega gull, variously considered a species in its own right, or one of the numerous forms of herring gull. Further east were more expanses of pools and marshland, and scrutiny of the large flocks of swans and geese produced a real bonus. The bird on the left is one of the numerous tundra forms of Buick swans, but the bigger one on the right had extensive yellow across the bill. It was a vagrant hooper swan, a major rarity here, and indeed across North America. Not quite hitting the same rarity stakes, but also unexpected, were a flock of canvasbacks, here alongside a few greater scaup. Viewed from the car, a fishing red-throated diver showed as well as the one had the previous day. Nearby were a pair of Pacific divers. Given their North American range, they are probably more deserving of their alternative name of Pacific loon. Note the puffy rounded head and lack of white visible on the flanks. Unlike these two, with more angular heads and an obvious white flank and thigh patch. These were black-throated divers, or Arctic loons as they're known here, of which we saw 3 more, and a mostly Eurasian species with a small and notably scarce population in western Alaska. The divers were far enough away, but even more distant were this pair of Sabine's gulls on a pool amongst a flock of northern pintail and American widgeon. We had lunch at the last train to nowhere, the rusty remains of derelict steam trains that were part of a planned rail link between Nome and Council, but abandoned in 1907. From here the Council Road turns inland, and not far north is the tiny settlement of Solomon. Away from the coast there is more vegetation here, and taking advantage of this habitat was a male eastern yellow wagtail. This is the Siberian form of the species which breeds across northern Eurasia, with a small and apparently declining breeding outpost in western Alaska. Nearby we saw our first musk ox. A known nest site for gyrfalcons deserved another stop. There were 4 healthy-looking chicks here on a bridge stanchion. And all watched over by a more distant adult perched on a crag. Then a Say's phoebe was deserving of another stop. The road climbed to the Skookum Pass and its truly wild and windswept terrain. A hovering long-tailed skua made good use of the conditions. birding was difficult given the weather, although we did find this semi-palmated plover and a more distant American pipit. Underfoot, the alpine tundra was sublime. And included woolly lousewort and a naked stemmed wallflower. On the return drive to Nome, we came across a male rock ptarmigan. It was in rather drab attire, referred to as a post-courtship plumage, and looked even worse when viewed through a car windscreen. For our second full day, we set out north along the Utqiagvik road. Enjoying more long-tailed skuas along the way. Having seen a distant northern shrike en route, we arrived at Salmon Lake in time for breakfast. The lakeside habitat proved good for passerines, including American tree sparrow. Golden-crowned sparrow, red fox sparrow, the most northerly breeding of the fox sparrow complex. And perched on the roof of a precariously leaning shack, a grey-cheeked thrush. Further roadside stops produced a perched short-eared owl, and a herd of muskox. Their name comes from the odour emitted by males during the rutting season. At this time of year, calves are much in evidence. Their incredibly soft but dense wool protecting them from the Arctic chill. Plus glorious views of the Seward Peninsula's Sawtooth Mountains. The sight of a Pacific diver on a small lake close to the road warranted another pullover. A stunning bird watched in perfect light. It was one of a pair, and the other was calling across the lake. Despite the American name of common loon for great northern divers, this is somewhat surprisingly the most abundant member of the family in North America. Back on the road, we drove up through rolling hills to our target site of Coffee Dome. This is a famous site for one particular rare species. Seeing it usually involves an uphill slog. However, we could hear one calling from where we'd parked the cars. A bristle-thighed curlew. It eventually flew over us, but too fast for any decent images. We searched the dome area where it appeared to land, but there was no sign. We returned to the road and walked back to a vegetated area of tundra. We had been told that a male bluethroat was holding territory here, and it was soon duly located on top of a bare willow and watched displaying. Like the wagtail seen the previous day, this is an Eurasian species with a restricted range in western Alaska. A white-crowned sparrow was close by. Satisfied with our lot, it was back to the cars, with plenty of time to enjoy the drive back to Nome. We took lunch by the Kozitrin River, where we'd stopped briefly on the drive to Coffee Dome. A bridge here was home to a colony of cliff swallows, busily collecting mud for their nests from the riverside. A calling grey-cheeked thrush was in the same area. As was this male common redpoll feeding on catkins. Northern wheatear was another target for this area, and was seen through the heat haze following a walk near Pilgrim Hot Springs. As we got closer to Nome, an appealing area of tundra close to a lake deserved another stop. A male Lapland bunting was advertising its territory. And a Hudsonian whimbrel was preening nearby. But most entertaining of all were a pair of approachable American golden plovers. The brighter plumage on the individual that showed best suggested it was a male. Eventually, it settled down on its nest. Time to leave it be and enjoy some of the alpine flowers, with more louseworts, possibly Langsdorffs, little weasel snout, and probably a type of bittercress. Further south, a female red-necked phalarope was foraging on a roadside pool. and we stopped at another known gyrfalcon nest site, this time with an adult feeding its young and just about visible in the heat haze. Surprisingly, on the same cliff and in the centre of the image here was a nesting rough-legged buzzard. And finally a pair of willow ptarmigan by the roadside. The female lacks any white on the underparts or the red combs above the eye. On our last day in Nome, our flight back to Anchorage wasn't until midday. So we elected for a morning venture back along the council road. A varied thrush at a quarry east of Cape Nome was some consolation for missing a vagrant brambling reported here in recent days. A calling white-crowned sparrow posed nicely in the same area. But a red fox sparrow was a little more challenging in the wind. Arriving back at the Nome River mouth, we found a red fox scavenging on the marsh. The Pacific golden plovers here were showing better than they had on our first day. They could be separated from the American species we'd seen the previous day, thanks to an overall more truncated appearance, white extending above the flanks, and spotting rather than solid black under the tail. And finally, and only seen in flight previously, reasonably good views of an Aleutian tern. Despite their resemblance to the Arctic terns also here, they are actually a different genus, and closely related to the likes of bridled tern.